The US reports substantial progress in weekend trade talks with China. A ceasefire between India and Pakistan is holding for now. China managed to reroute a lot of semiconductor and other exports in April. And ANZ Research raises its milk price forecast in New Zealand to a record high $10 a kilogram. That's coming up in our 5 Things in 5 Minutes on Monday, May the 12th. And then in our deep dive interview, ANZ Economist Bansi Madhavani explains a divergence that has developed between the economies of South Korea and Taiwan, despite facing the same tariff shocks to their exports to the US.
Taiwan is seeming to benefit from this surge in demand for semiconductor exports and investments, but South Korea's growth is showing susceptibility to auto exports, steel exports, in addition to the fact that its own domestic impulse is quite weak owing to political uncertainty.
But first, in 5 and 5 with ANZ, global markets will begin the week in a hopeful mood after US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said after 2 days of trade talks with China's Vice Premier in Geneva, there had been, quote, substantial progress, unquote. Also, a truce in a disturbing conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir seems to be holding, and Vladimir Putin has proposed peace talks with Volodymyr Zelensky, although the Ukrainian leader wants a truce first. Markets have yet to react to the trade progress and the diplomatic news, but there was some positive trade news on Friday, with China's exports being better overall than expected in April because exports were rerouted to other countries, says ANZ China economist Vicky Xiaozhou.
We found that China has increased its semiconductor export to Asian countries and India, and also increased its imports from Taiwan and South Korea, rerouting via Hong Kong. This rerouted trade suggests it is difficult to exclude China from the current global supply chain.
Number 2. That didn't mean China's trade with the United States was unaffected in the first full month of the 145% tariffs, as Vicky explains.
China's exports to the US dropped by 21%, while imports also dropped by 14% from the US. This decline in bilateral trade has occurred more rapidly than during the first China-US trade war. We expect further declines between two countries' direct trade unless tariffs could be negotiated to below 50%.
Number 3. China's consumer price inflation and producer price inflation data for April came out over the weekend, with both headline rates recording deflation from a year ago. ANZ senior China strategist Zhao Pengxing says core annual CPI inflation was stable at 0.5%.
Looking forward, the US tariff will add deflationary pressure, but we expect China core CPI to be stable, considering the strong policy support to consumers.
Number 4. In Japan on Friday, wages data was softer than expected, at least at the headline level. ANZ FX strategist Felix Ryan says the underlying data remains solid enough for the Bank of Japan to keep looking to normalise policy with rate hikes, although not anytime soon.
When we look at some of the smooth wage growth data, so data for full-time salaries, for instance, we did see that still growing at a healthy 2% year over year, basically in line with what we saw in February. Additionally, we did see household spending data for March at a solid 2.1% year over year, up from the minus 0.5% back in February. Even so, given the elevated level of trade uncertainty and policy uncertainty in the world at the moment, we do think the Bank of Japan will still have a cautious approach to further policy normalization and rate hikes from here on in. So we only see one more rate hike from the Bank of Japan this year in October, a 25 basis point hike there, and another hike now in April of next year.
Number 5. In New Zealand, there's good news for farmers and the rural economy. ANZ Research has upgraded its forecast for the all-important milk payout to $10 a kilogram for the current season, up 15 cents, and $10 for the next season, up $1 a kilo. Here's ANZ New Zealand Chief Economist Sharon Zollner.
Even since Liberation Day and all that global turmoil and some dark clouds over global growth, we've actually had 2 auctions where dairy prices increased. So global dairy supply is looking quite constrained for a range of reasons. China's dairy farmers are finding it very hard to be profitable. European dairy farmers are constrained by environmental regulation, for example, and some of those constraints will persist.
Sharon Zollner there. Now, in today's deep dive interview, ANZ economist Bansi Madhavani explains why there's been a divergence in growth this year between South Korea, which has started softly, and Taiwan, which began the year with a 5.4% surge in GDP in the March quarter from a year ago. I began by asking what's up with Taiwan.
If you look at gross capital formation, that added 3.7 percentage points to headline growth, and net exports added over 1 percentage point to headline growth. Now, if you contrast that with what the experience was for the South Korean economy, the first quarter GDP in fact showed contraction of 0.1% on a year-on-year basis. The weakness was quite broad-based when you look at private consumption, government spending, and investments. In fact, investments contracted 2% on a quarter-on-quarter basis. Now, net exports were positive, but that's largely because imports declined rather than exports did. So what seems to be emerging is that this early impact of US tariffs and trade tensions, we're seeing that this early impact is quite different for both the economies.
What's the driving factor?
On the one hand, Taiwan is seeming to benefit from this surge in demand for semiconductor exports and investments, but South Korea's growth is showing susceptibility to auto exports, steel exports, in addition to the fact that its own domestic impulse is quite weak owing to political uncertainty.
Can this divergence last?
This can't last for long. At some point in time, the global trade tensions will reflect in both the economies. We can argue that the degree of vulnerability would be different for both between Taiwan and South Korea, but definitely the direction of travel would be more growth headwinds going into second and third quarter.
Why couldn't Taiwan's strength continue past the June quarter?
The number one risk that we're looking at is the fact that semiconductors can be tariffed by the US at some point. So far, they are exempt, but the US administration has repeatedly said that they will look into bringing semiconductors under the ambit of tariffs. And that's a big deal for Taiwan, where over 2/3 of its exports are semiconductor and electronics related. The other risk that weighs on Taiwan's growth outlook, in our view, is the fact that we are seeing rising risks of US recession, and that will weigh on overall global growth outlook, and that would mean a slower export growth cycle as well. Now, directly, if you see the linkage, Taiwan exports something over 23% of its goods to the US, but there's also a sizable indirect linkage because some of the Taiwan's goods that it makes would be made for some third economy where there would be value addition, assembly before it ultimately gets shipped on to the US.
And how are Taiwan's trade talks with the US going? Seems slow.
First round of talks were concluded last week, but we're still far from a deal. Now, as per the reciprocal tariff announcement by President Trump, Taiwan's good would be subject to 32% tariffs. Maybe that's not the end game. We do expect that this will be negotiated and brought down closer to the 10% ballpark, but that negotiation will still take some time for it to evolve.
And why does South Korea look vulnerable?
South Korea, unfortunately, has its own set of woes, even keeping aside this US tariff tensions. Like, the domestic political situation is quite fluid. We have upcoming elections on the 3rd of June. So these political shifts have been brewing for a while, and they have weighed on business and household sentiment the last few months. And then coming to tariffs, as I said, South Korea is affected not just by the prospect of semiconductor tariffs, but its steel and auto sector is also as vulnerable. So in terms of the trade discussion between Korea and US, trade talks have begun, but any meaningful discussion looks likely only after the new government is formed, which would be following the 3rd June elections. So there are significant growth headwinds looming for South Korea as well.
So how might the central banks in Taiwan and South Korea respond differently?
In the case of Taiwan, we are expecting the central bank, the CBC, to adopt a more cautious stance. Our view is that the CBC will keep the policy rate unchanged this year. They might resort to easing reserve ratios if there is a requirement for them to support growth, but perhaps the first preference would be to keep the policy rate unchanged in our view. But the Bank of Korea's response could be quite different. Now, the Bank of Korea itself says that they are in a rate cutting cycle, and our baseline forecast is that we will get additional 50 basis points of rate cut in the coming month. But there are risks that if growth headwinds intensify, then more rate cuts could be delivered if needed.
Bansi Madhavani there. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was 5 and 5 with ANZ for Monday, May the 12th. Catch you tomorrow with a preview of tomorrow night's US inflation data for April. This podcast contains general information only, not investment advice. You should obtain advice for your personal circumstances before making any investment decisions. Please view the podcast disclaimer available via your media player or email.